Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from UnHerd's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Matt Walsh. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and at undercurrents.tv for even longer versions of these interviews and the full premium experience. As you likely already know, Matt is out with a provocative and genuinely funny new documentary called Am I Racist? While film critics have largely ignored the movie, much to Matt's amusement, it's been the subject of headlines all week. Matt's first Daily Wire documentary, What is a Woman?, turned into somewhat of a surprise hit back in 2022. It featured Matt asking prominent advocates of transgender ideology the simple question, what is a woman? The results of this experiment were fascinating, which I think explained the organic surge of interest. Twitter initially labeled the film hate speech before Elon Musk reversed the policy. Then Musk himself posted, quote, every parent should watch this. Now, this time around, Walsh went undercover in order to satirize the absurdities many analysts have long pointed out in the work of anti-racism activists like Syra Rao and Robin DiAngelo, people on the left and the right, I should say. Am I Racist now has a 99% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. When you get a Bernie Sanders-loving comedian like Joe Rogan saying a conservative documentary is, quote, one of the best comedies he's seen in a long time, something interesting is happening. So here now, to make sense of all of this, is Matt Walsh himself, who joins us from our UnHerd Washington studio. Matt Walsh, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you explain the goal of Am I a Racist? Obviously, it was to answer the question in the title, Am I a Racist? What in particular were you hoping to prove with the movie and with that adventure in finding out whether or not you were a racist, Matt?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's a different, our first movie, What is a Woman? That was the question that question, the title sustained the whole movie. And of course, we didn't get an answer until the very end. I don't want to give spoilers away on that film. But it's a very different kind of question because that's what starts me on my journey of self-discovery, of trying to decenter my whiteness and whatnot. But in this case, the people we're talking to have no problem answering that question. Like, they don't want to answer what is a woman, but if I ask them, am I racist? They'll tell me right away, yes, you are. And so we get the answer to that question in the first interview of the film. But that's really, rather than that being the conclusion, that's just the door that opens up the rest of the film. Because once I've been told I'm racist, well, now it's like, okay, well, what do I do next? What do I do about that? And we wanted them to kind of guide us on that journey, which they do in the movie.
Well, and the answer by their definition is yes for even themselves. Am I correct in saying that? If you read Robin DiAngelo, it's this idea that implicit bias is something that you can work to eradicate, but not ever fully eradicate. It will always be with you. So the answer is we are all racists if you are white. If you're non-white, you don't have implicit bias. It's a strange definition. Yeah,
their definition of racism is... And actually, this part I found a little bit reluctant to say out loud. I think because they know that it's crazy and it's indefensible. But their actual definition is that if you're white, you're inherently racist and can never be not racist. And if you're black, then you can never be racist. And if you're some race other than white or black, then it gets a little murky about whether you can be racist or not. But this they're sure of, that white is inherently racist. In fact, Robin DiAngelo says in the movie, at any given moment, you can be a little bit less racist or a little bit more racist. So you're on the spectrum, but it's not a spectrum from racist to not racist. It's a spectrum from a little racist to very racist. And the way she tells it is that she says any given moment, like there's really no progress to be made ultimately because you're always just swaying back and forth wildly down the spectrum, which of course, if you take these people seriously, it's a very hopeless view. Mm-hmm. And if you're the kind of person who's really worried about being called racist, which that's where they make all their money is from those kinds of people, the people that hear an accusation of racism and are devastated by it. And if you're one of those people, then it's a hopeless and despair-inducing reality because you can never be
forgiven.
You can never be free of it. You can never be cured of this disease that they've convinced you have.
Mm. I also wonder about the definition because what the definition as Syra Rao and Robin DiAngelo peddle it, or Ibram X. Kendi peddle it. By the way, why is he not in the movie, Matt?
We tried. I mean, we reached out to him many times, but he's quite a bit more cautious, and I think especially now. And the thing is that while we're making the film, his own sort of world was crumbling down around him as he was being increasingly exposed as a grifter. And so he was very, very, like, he's not going to go and talk to you unless he's 1,000% sure that it's going to be nothing but me praising him for being so courageous. So
Right. You couldn't quite convince him that you would.
couldn't
Right.
get him.
So, but the D'Angelos and the Ibram X. Kendis of the world have this definition based on implicit bias. And we got into this a little bit yesterday on Breaking Points, actually. There's another definition of racism that is actually systemic bias. That's probably the consensus definition of racism in America is that you think someone is inferior and you discriminate against them based on the color of their skin. But there's this other definition that's more about outcomes. And that's sort of what my co-host Ryan Grimm at Breaking Points was saying, that if a system produces disparate outcomes, whether they're good or they're bad, but if they're bad, that is systemic racism. I think there has to be some evidence that in a country that had hundreds of years of actual institutionalized slavery, of course, generational wealth, some of those things are still on the table. But aren't these two things completely different definitions? Like when most Americans hear, oh, that's racist, they don't think, oh, that's producing a disparate outcome. They think whatever you're doing is rooted in hatred and malice of someone, or this belief that they're inferior because of the color of their skin. Is it semantic to some extent, how we actually talk about racism?
I think, well, it's not really semantics because the difference between those two things is quite vast. But the advantage that the Robin DiAngelos of the world have is that they equate the two. They sort of sway between the two when you talk about racism.
Yes.
And they especially like to do that because if you get into this back and forth, and we did this in the movie, where they tell you, yeah, you're white, so you're racist, and you say, but I'm not. I know what's in my own mind, and I'm not racist. I don't know what to tell you. I don't have any. How can you tell me that I have these thoughts and feelings about so-called people of color if I'm telling you I don't? Like, how do you don't know more about what's in my mind than I do? And what I discovered anyway is that when you get into that, they're kind of backed into a wall because, yeah, they can't. What are they going to say to you? No, I know what's more about what's in your mind than you do. And that's when they will retreat to the, well, it's a systemic issue and so on and so forth, which even if all that was true, even if America was systemically racist, which I absolutely reject the claim that it is, that still would not mean that I'm racist. You know, that would just be that, okay, there's an issue with the system we need to fix. But that doesn't do anything to prove that an individual white person is racist. So I think that there is a conflating that goes on between these two things.
Right, yeah, and if we're calling, for example, low taxes, like lower taxes on the rich, racist, which is an argument that you will actually hear, absolutely. I mean, part of what you do in the film is show how everything can be called racist if the outcome is fundamentally affecting different races in different ways. That's a very different argument than someone says, I want low taxes because white people will have more money. These are two enormously different things that seem to be conflated in a way that actually implicates average Americans, decent people, in awful bigotry.
Right, exactly. And that's the problem with the whole disparate outcome idea, that you're always going to have so-called disparate outcomes with anything. Any policy, any system, any program, anything that you do in life that involves vast amounts of people, there's going to be disparate outcomes in the sense that not everyone's going to have the same outcome. And of course not. And you could look at that and that could just be a reflection of people are different. I think often it is. It could be an indication that there's issues within the system, that there's something unfair in the system. That could also be the case. You have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But to immediately ascribe that all to racism, I think, is absurd, and it's done without evidence. And I think even the conversation we had yesterday, there was a little bit of we kind of went from systemic racism to, by the end of the conversation, to me, it had turned into, well, there are systemic problems. It's like, well, yeah, there might be, of course there are systemic problems. I mean, the system isn't perfect, but systemic racism is a specific type of problem. And to me, in order to prove that, you would have to show evidence that the system is deliberately trying to create disadvantages for Black people because they're Black. And if you can't do that, then the best you can do is indicate systemic problems, which I wish we could just have that conversation, you know?
Right, because by that definition, I suppose, of systemic racism, you could say that America will never be rid of systemic racism because the system itself was originally based in legal slavery, that it never goes away. It's baked into the system, and that's 1619 Project.
Right, and the problem with that, there's a lot of problems with that, but I think the biggest problem is that, and this is when you get into the legacy, the legacy of slavery is still alive, and all these things, and Black people were at such a disadvantage 150 years ago that still maintains, and so that's systemic. The problem with all of that is that when you start playing that game, it can really apply to any group of people. I mean, you take any group of people and you trace their lineage back far enough, or most groups of people, you trace their lineage back far enough, you're going to find a time in history when they were treated in a really terrible way. You can probably find a time in history when they were enslaved, or when they were discriminated against. I mean, you can do that even in this country, as people often point out. For example, I'm of Irish descent, and the Irish were not exactly beloved when they first came to this country.
Yes, but there were reasons for that, Matt.
Well, of course. I mean, I can only go based myself. If all the Irish are like me, I understand why. But you could do that with any group. You could do it with Asians. I know that's another common argument, which I think is quite compelling. That we know that Asians were discriminated against, sometimes in quite significant ways.
Yeah.
And yet now, not only are Asians having better than equal outcomes to white people. In fact, that they're, by almost every measure, whether you're looking at financial, academic, they're performing better than white people, which is another problem, I think, for the systemic racism advocates or proponents of that idea. I don't know how you deal with that exactly.
That's an interesting point. What about to what extent do you think racism still exists? And I'm sure you get this question a lot from this movie. Like, to what extent do you think, we probably both agree that racism is never going to be fully eradicated? That consensus definition of racism where you have some sense of inferiority. People who don't look like you are inferior to you because of the color of their skin, and they should be discriminated based on that. Almost impossible to eradicate, let alone from such a multicultural country like ours. And we deal with it, I think, in historically spectacular, wonderful ways as of recent American history. It seems to not be lasting, but to what extent does it still exist? Is it coming back?
I mean, it still exists. You're always going to have racism in society, and that's one of the things that you have to. It's not that we accept racism on any individual basis. Like, if you encounter actual racism, I'm not saying that we have to say, well, that's fine. You just have to accept it. But you have to accept the reality that it exists. It's like, it's like cancer. Any individual person who has cancer, you want to try to give them treatment. But we do have to accept the reality that that's a thing that happens in the world. And I think, not to extend the analogy too far, but you even hear from Joe Biden about we're going to get rid of cancer completely. It's like when you hear that from politicians, it's like, well, it seems like you're not actually taking the problem that seriously. If you're trying to convince me that in the next 5 years there's not going to be any cancer, no, it will still be here in 5 years. So let's take that reality and then deal within that reality to do everything we can within that reality to mitigate the problem as much as we can. Now the analogy breaks down because cancer is an actual physical illness that theoretically we could actually eradicate at some point. Hopefully we will. Racism is different because it's a problem of the human heart, and it's not a physical illness. And so it's like hatred or greed or envy. You're never going to live in a world where that doesn't exist at all. And so all we can do is try to mitigate it. And you also, and the most important point for all of this is that you have to take it see it as the individual phenomenon that it is, and deal with it like that.
Does that I mean, I wonder, is that almost an argument for implicit bias, that it's always with us, that people are sort of naturally, they have these natural inclinations to be in their tribes or something to that extent. And there's always going to be tensions between people of different races if they are, in close quarters, like in the United States of America. Is that implicit bias? Is that endemic racism? Is this semantics again?
Yeah, well, I don't think it is, because I think these are all different things. I think that racism and implicit bias are two different things. I mean, implicit bias, it's a buzz term these people use. But sure, there's a way to understand it where it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, people have biases. Everyone does. If you're a human being with your own perspective in the world, you're going to have a bias. You might even have, as an individual, you might have even sometimes biases that take into account race, but that doesn't necessarily make you racist. So, for example, and this would be seen as controversial, I suppose, which is stupid. If you're walking down, for some reason, a back alley at night, in the city somewhere, and you see a little old lady walking by you, you're probably not going to be that worried. If you see a young black male walking by you, you're going to be more concerned. And so, yeah, there's some bias that goes into that, but it's bias based in statistical realities that you're aware of. And it's not because you hate black people or you think they're inferior to you, but you're just aware that, young black males commit a vastly disproportionate amount of violent crime. Little old ladies commit almost none, at least none of the crime that you have to worry about, right? And so that's an example of what these DEI people would call implicit bias. And they would point to that and say, there you go, see, racism. But it's not racism. That's just making statistical, assumptions for your own, in this case, for your own safety. But it's not based in any kind of hatred or feeling of superiority over anybody else.
So in that case, there might be an argument that taking race into consideration is wrong in certain cases because maybe it contributes to, or maybe it's immoral in a circumstance, but it's not based on this inferiority, this sense that there's inferiority involved. So like I'm thinking of affirmative action as the flip version of the analogy you just laid out. So a lot of conservatives will say, and I actually think I agree, affirmative action is explicitly racist. Now, are there programs that say we want to give opportunities to people in areas where there aren't a lot of opportunities to go to college or something? Like kids struggle to get into college because of a variety of reasons, and this area is disproportionately black, or this area is a higher concentration of black kids. So it might make sense then to have programs aimed at helping black kids get into college. Affirmative action in and of itself, that is the system. I mean, that was baked into the system until the recent Supreme Court order. So again, I'm trying not to get caught up in semantics, but some of it to me just seems like everyone has a different definition of the word that you were trying to define in the film.
Yeah, I think so. And affirmative action is an example of actual systemic racism. Of course, the people that use the term systemic racism would never include that in it because they would say that, well, no, that is meant to negate systemic racism or to be a cure for it, which doesn't make any sense because how can you cure the thing by creating it? And anytime you see that actually in the system, baked into a policy, well, then it's racism and then it's wrong. And so, like going back to my example of walking down a back alley, we all know that you see the little old lady, you're not going to be concerned. You see a young black male, you'd be more concerned because of the statistical realities of it. And on an individual basis, that there's nothing wrong with having that thought process that everybody would have. It's not immoral and it's not racist, but you can't put that in. If you try to put that into the system, if you say passed a law saying, well, that means that young black males aren't allowed to walk down back alleys anymore. Well, then that's wrong. That is a race-based law that is deliberately negatively impacting a person based on race. And I would oppose that because that would be systemic racism. And so I think maybe I'm off on a tangent that's not related to your point, but I think that, that's why you have to separate like an individual person and the thoughts that are going through your own head and distinguish that from systems and policies that we put in place. So,
and as a Christian, is the back alley example, I'm imagining, a Russell Moore in my head right now, is the back alley example, is that unchristian? Is it, to judge somebody with anything but equal dignity as a child of God? Is there something about that's
no
undermines?
No, I mean, if you were to say that, well, if you were to state as a matter of principle that every young black male is dangerous and can never be anything but that, well, then that's unchristian.
Because of the color of their skin.
Right. But simply noticing statistical realities, that's not, it's Christian, if anything, because it's the truth. And as Christians, we're supposed to be knowledgeable of the truth, and we're not supposed to reject the truth. And this is, this is what is required to be a functional, discerning human being in the world. We're always, having to make assumptions about people and situations without all the information. And then if you get more information, well, then your calculation changes. But you can't operate in the world without that. And so that's why I use the back alley example, because this is just, you're seeing someone, you don't know anything else about them. And so for your own safety, you just have to make quick judgment calls based on your knowledge of statistical realities. And that's it.
This movie is becoming another flashpoint in this inter-Nicene Christian conservative conversation about ethics and what's an appropriate way to sort of fight bad political ideas in the arena of public discourse. Denny Burke, I think, was one critic who said you've used deception in the film, and you said I don't want to quibble over the word deception, but one of the reasons conservatives don't make good art is because every time somebody does something like comedy, everyone is already eager to pounce and pile on. Could you get into that just a little bit more? Tell us what you mean, and why. Give us your ethical defense of am I a racist if Denny Burke were here right now? Yeah,
it's him, and there's been a few other Christians that I've seen on social media that are kind of, in my mind, sort of nitpicking, which I find, they have every right to do that, and in some ways, that's just another element of the conversation started by the film, and I am happy that if people are talking about the film and if they come away with thinking about things, then I consider that a win. But this particular criticism seems to me to be nitpicking. As I said when I responded to that, I don't agree with the characterization of deception. I didn't lie to these people, and we didn't lie to them. I mean, the basic information they had going in is that we're making a documentary on anti-racism, which we were.
Is a disguise a lie? Like in the dinner scene, you're in a disguise?
No, I don't think that disguise is a lie, especially in the context of you're playing a character. And there's also comedy, so you don't want to get into explaining the joke, but there's a scene in the movie where I give a fake name, but I am deliberately saying it in a way that I stumble over the fake name that I'm giving, because they're supposed to know that it's fake. That's the joke. And you
said, "Hi, I'm Ben Shapiro."
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Even the wig I'm wearing is, as many people have pointed out, it's not the most convincing wig, which again is part of the joke. So that's the humor of it. But I could even, for the sake of argument, I could say, okay, fine, we'll use deception. If I were to agree for the sake of argument, I can still defend it even as deception if that's what it was, which it wasn't. And because you can come up with many examples of deception being used in a way that almost nobody would take issue with. And, one example would be undercover journalism. Dave Daleiden in the Center for Medical Progress, they exposed the trafficking of unborn baby parts by Planned Parenthood. We would not know that without deception. I mean, they told lies in order to find that information out. Undercover cops. I mean, this is how we catch pedophiles before they do horrendous things to kids. And if we're going to take the absolutist position that deception can never be used as a Christian, then basically what you're saying is that, well, a lot more kids are going to be abused because we're not allowed to use deception to catch pedophiles. Not very many people would take that position. And now you could point out that, in our film, I'm not an undercover cop. this is not really journalism. I'm not claiming that. It is entertainment. We are making a piece of entertainment.
Because Burke said it was in the context of war, deception is defensible.
Right. But if we can agree that those other scenarios, deception's okay, then we're at least agreeing that this is not an absolutist thing and that there are scenarios where it's morally acceptable to use deception. And once we're there, well, first of all, I think we're at a pretty good starting point. And then it's just a question of, well, is this one of those morally acceptable times? And I would say that it is, because we are exposing, this might not be a physical war, but the culture war that we're in is a real world war in many other senses of the word. And we're exposing evil people who are doing real significant damage to the culture. And I don't see how that wouldn't fall into the same general category of these other examples that I gave. And this is not an ends justify the means thing, but it is, I do want to point out that this is the only way to expose these people. So if you're going to say, well, we can never mislead them, then what you're saying is, well, we can never really expose them. Because look, making arguments in a podcast, as I do all the time, is fine. That is not exposing Robin DiAngelo. Reading the book and giving a bad review is not exposing her. That's presenting a counter argument. Fantastic. Exposing her requires her to come out from behind her kind of intellectual fortress and come out into the open and be vulnerable. And they just are not going to do that willingly. If we had made this film and just come into it and told everyone, hey, the Daily Wire, Matt Walsh, we're doing a movie, critical of come talk to us. None of the people in the movie would be in the movie to begin with. And if any of them did show up in the movie, then we would have a series of debates, not unlike what you see on cable news every day. And it would be, first of all, a much worse film, which I think does matter. But you're not actually exposing this thing for the grift and the scam that it is. And that was our ultimate goal, and I think we succeeded.
One question before we wrap about my favorite part in the film is when you talk to different Black Americans. And I'm curious if you've heard from them since the movie came out and what you think they make of, the Robin DiAngelos of the world based on your experience having these conversations. It seems like you talked to a lot of like normal middle class Black people in the US who would be very confused by a white woman like Robin DiAngelo telling them that everything is racist.
Yeah, I don't think we've heard from any of them. I'd love to hear from them, and also the bikers at the biker bar. But also these are people. That's kind of our point. These are people that are not really on social media.
Right.
I'm not even sure if they're aware that the movie's out. I hope that they are. I'd love to have a screening for them or something if they haven't seen it. But that was. I think if they saw the movie in context, they would. Fairly certain they would agree with the overall point and message of the film, because the point and message of the film is what they said. Like, they are the message. Both that series of scenes with the biker bar and then the Black community in New Orleans, what we hear from them is basically the thesis of the movie, which is nothing very complex. And the basic idea is just, if not for Robin DiAngelo and Cyber Rao and their crew, if you exist outside of that bubble, then you live a life, in modern America anyway, where race and racism are not even close to a central focus of your life. It's not a big deal to you. It's part of your life. I mean, you notice someone else's race. That's fine. It's part of who they are, part of who you are.
And they might disagree with you about the scale that it still exists on, but
sure. They might. But what I know from talking to them is that they don't think that, the system is stacked against them to an extent that, like, they can't live their life or they can't be successful, or that, they're victims. The people that we talk to are not people who walk around every day feeling like they're being victimized by a racist system. And I know that because we asked them directly. And not only did we get a no, but they were almost confused by the question. And in particular, there's a scene with, his name is Milton, the black car mechanic outside of his shop. And it was interesting with him because not only did he deny this stuff about systemic racism, but he thought it was funny. Like, he laughed at it in a good-natured way, but just because it's so outside of his everyday experience that as to be absurd. And I think that's kind of the main thing we wanted to bring out in the film.
Matt Walsh, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe on the Undercurrents YouTube channel, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. Thanks so much for tuning in. We are here every day, so we will see you next Monday.